This video discusses death and other sensitive topics. Viewer discretion is advised.
Let's say you have only 18 months left to live. Would you do anything to stay remembered after you pass? Well, a man going by in bin Laden was met with these exact circumstances, so he made a capsule of how he viewed the world at the time. However, this isn't exactly a wholesome view expressing how much he loved the world and his family. Or at least it doesn't seem like that. Let me introduce you to deathandhell.com, the website Infek made shortly after learning he would die of cancer. A lot of the imagery is reminiscent of the early internet days, probably because it was made in the early internet days. If you were to open the site back when it was made, you would be greeted by this. There are 23 directories you could enter, each of which have even more pages to delve into. The directories go over different aspects of Infek's life and things that either happened to him or things that mattered to him. What lays in each directory is oftentimes all over the place, so instead of dissecting each directory individually, I'll just discuss the main topics found on the site as a whole, starting with magic. If you go to the Infek bin Laden directory and enter the early magical experiences section, you can read quite a few stories about exactly that, his early life magic related experiences. The first story goes like this. Infek, age 5, is at Myrtle Beach with his relatives on vacation. Infek was out on the beach playing with a plastic bucket and shovel nearing time for dinner. His bucket and shovel ended up getting swallowed up by the water and swept out into the Atlantic Ocean. He was called home for dinner by his mother, and he was quite sad about the loss of his toys. His grandmother overheard the complaints, and she said to Infek, "Don't worry honey, I'll have it for you tomorrow morning." Infek states in this writing that he heard she was the 7th child of a 7th child, which is a part of Appalachian culture. The 7th daughter of a 7th daughter is believed to possess unique abilities. Just that next morning, Infek went to the beach to watch the sunrise. He saw a figure in the distance approaching though. That figure ended up being his grandmother, holding his plastic bucket and shovel. Infek claimed to understand the whole 7th daughter of a 7th daughter thing at that age. So from then on, he never doubted the power of magic. That's where the story ends. However, there are more. This second story is much more interesting, but also much longer. On the 21st of September, 1977, Infek met a Native American or Hispanic woman and spent his afternoon at her house. There were multiple other women there, and they eventually invited him to go upstairs to observe a tarot reading. He declined. A little while later, one of the women came down the stairs, looking depressed. Infek asked what was wrong, and she said that a young girl would die in the house that night. Infek tried telling her that tarot cards could not be interpreted so concisely, and that the likelihood of that happening was low. One of the cards represented a young maiden, and the card laying across from it was death. The woman kept insisting that either someone would die in the house, or someone closely associated with someone in the house would die that night. Later that night, he went upstairs with one of the women, and they had sex. During the sexual encounter, the woman appeared to go into a trance, and became quite distant. Infek asked what was wrong, and she said something will happen tonight that will change your life forever. He said he felt uncomfortable, and wanted to leave. It doesn't matter if you leave or not, your life will never be the same again after tonight, she stated. As she finished speaking, the door of the bedroom opened by itself. Infek, feeling uneasy, half-jokingly said it looks like a ghost just entered the room. Infek felt as if what he said wasn't even a joke at that point. The woman remained silent. Infek was too disturbed and rushed out. After grabbing his drugs, he was high on opiates and cocaine at the time, and was carrying more, but he says that he never felt more lucid in his life. Infek's younger sister was supposed to be visiting him that night, but he didn't make it home in time. On the Interstate 90, he was going over 100 miles per hour at 3 a.m., which he would get pulled over for. As he was attempting to hide all his drugs, he realized that this could be the event to change his life forever. A Seattle police officer clocked him going over 90 miles per hour, where the speed limit was 55. Infek assumed it would be considered negligent driving or worse. The officer looked at his driver's license and handed it back looking as if he was about to cry. The officer said, "Please slow down." Then he walked back to his cruiser and left. Feeling spared, he headed east on Interstate 90. As he was coming over the hill at Eastgate heading to Issaquah, he saw an aid unit with flashing lights driving up the hill towards him. There wasn't one other car on that road. Infek got a strange feeling that somebody had really lost something precious that night. As he approached the turn to where he lived, he saw a fire truck on the road a few blocks from his house, hosing broken glass off the street. The next morning, he received a call from his youngest sister, telling him he needed to call the medical examiner's office. The person in the car that he passed on the highway was his sister. She died approximately right when the door opened by itself during his sexual encounter with the woman. Infek did not attend the Christian funeral his parents set up. Instead, he set up a shrine for her in a Tibetan Buddhist house near the University of Washington campus. With some help of some Tibetan Buddhist friends, they performed the Bardo Thuddle ceremonies as his sister requested. She was launched into the rainbow realms as planned. For context, Bardo Thuddle ceremonies are a part of Tibetan Buddhist culture. They are texts recited after one's recent passing to ease the consciousness of the deceased individual and help assist them into a more favorable rebirth. I was unable to find anything on Rainbow Realms. Within 2 weeks of her death, Infek needed to process what was happening. So, in search of some answers, he returned to the huge house in West Seattle where the Native American women lived. However, when he got there, there was no house. Just a vacant lot and a pile of ashes. Infek claimed to see one of them again about a year later in a crowd, but that was it. Now we are introduced to someone new, known as MG. MG was very close with Infek's sister, and had a dream he described as being unusual. The dream included Infek's sister sitting down next to MG, holding his hand, then telling him, "Everything will be alright." 2 years later, MG is involved in a nearly fatal car accident, which he survives, up until he reaches the operating table, where he is briefly dead. MG awakens in a field of flowers, where Infek's sister was. She reached down and inspected a small flower, then she says this one's not ready yet. MG describes floating over the stretcher as he was wheeled into the ambulance. He remembers the doctor pronouncing him dead as he hovered over the operating table. MG suffered extensive brain damage and was never the same after the accident, but now he's entirely lucid and mostly functional. He insists that he met Infek's sister in the afterlife. Infek's sister had a friend named Nita. Nita called Infek's mother once, saying that after years of struggling with depression, she attempted suicide. She overdosed on pills and was rushed to the ER. She was declared dead on arrival. However, moments later, she was revived and ended up fully recovered. Nita told Infek's mother that she experienced a near-death experience where she felt out of her body. When she was out of her body, she met his sister. Nita called his mother to tell her how profound her experience was and how from it, she was no longer depressed or suicidal. At age 12, Infek and his sister made a pact. Whoever died first of the two would do whatever they could to leave a sign for the other. If you are the first to go, leave a sign to let us know. The next story isn't a story, it's mail. A letter describing Infek's high school life and how he isn't fit to serve in the military. The letter describes how in junior year of high school, Infek was already doing psychedelics, and quite a bit too. Infek described having kinesthetic hallucinations to some degree all the time, even if he hadn't done any psychedelics for a month. That is most definitely a major reason he experienced most of what he did, especially relating to what happened with his sister. Infek stated that, although he was on opiates and cocaine, he never felt more lucid before. Just because he felt lucid doesn't mean he really was. Hallucinations with opiates are very rare, but still possible, and hallucinations with cocaine are fairly common. Maybe he was on other drugs too, or the mix of opiates and cocaine was too intense. Even if neither of those were the root cause of the hallucinations, according to the letter, he was still experiencing kinesthetic hallucinations to some degree all the time. Kinesthetic hallucinations give the feeling that body parts are moving, when in reality they aren't, which explains quite a lot. This early magical experiences part of the site isn't the only section that discusses magic, though. The term working sex magician comes up quite a lot throughout the site and its many pages, but that's just a joke term for sex worker, so we can skip over that as it's brought up. However, just sex magician is different. A sex magician is someone who uses sexual energy to help harness and direct their intentions towards a specific goal. There are multiple kinds of sex magic, 3 of which I think apply to what Infek meant whenever he brought it up. Symbolic sex magic is using sexual activities as representation of an outcome that the person initially desired. Ritualistic sex magic is performing sexual acts for a ritual or ceremony to invoke entities or specific energies. Energy manipulation is what was described first, using energy to manipulate or direct someone's intentions towards a specific outcome. Infek brings up sex magic quite a lot throughout the site, as it was very important in his life. When I say quite a lot, I mean it. Back to magic as a whole though, there is an interesting passage in the Corpus Nouveau section. It states that in life, everyone eventually realizes they need to use magic as more than just a system to make it truly powerful. Magic must be your lifeblood, as magic is all about the self. One can't move mountains without first knowing where those mountains are in your world. It then goes into detail about gematria and numerology, but that doesn't matter as much as the bottom of the page. It says author, Thought Master's Eye, with his email beneath. Infek oftentimes throughout the site will put passages that friends, associates, or just random people wrote, and that is an instance of that. Infek met many like-minded Satanist individuals in his life, even online. However, Satanist doesn't even get close to describing what Infek really believed. Infek identified as a psychedelic chaos Satanist. So, what is that? Well, it's a term coined by none other than Infek bin Laden himself. It's a type of Satanist that takes lots of psychedelics, but there's more to it. Austin Osman Spare was a Satanist back in the olden days, and he was the one who created the idea of sigil magic. Another man named Peter Carroll would take inspiration from that in order to birth the idea of chaos magic, which Infek was deeply invested in and believed wholeheartedly. Peter would go on to make an organization called the Illuminates of Thanatarus, which hosted many gatherings, some of which Infek attended. In the 666 Ways to Sunday section of the site, you can find a page called Satanic Bible Thumper. In that page is a passage starting with the sentence, "The basic tool for the manipulation of consciousness is the use of illegal psychedelic drugs." It's not something Infek attempts to hide, as he completely and proudly believes that the usage of psychedelics is important for personal growth. So, mix the two, psychedelics and chaos Satanism, then you get psychedelic chaos Satanism, a new approach to Satanism, mixed with many previous influences. And this isn't necessarily the kind of Satanist that worships Satan, but it's the kind that has a disliking for organized religion. But back to the website. This site got most of its recognition, not for the interesting personal stories of Infek, but instead for the disturbing violent imagery and pages pertaining to the topic of rape and necrophilia. Throughout the site you can find weird fetish imagery, dead bodies edited to look even grosser, fake fetus looking things, weird doll figures hanging by nooses, and other vile images and gifs. So, why all the disturbing everything? Well, deathandhell.com is purposely decorated with abhorrent and disgusting imagery and topics on purpose to cloak the true inner beauty of the site. That inner beauty will be brought up later. But in order to understand why the site is so amazing, we have to first get to know Infek. Infek bin Laden is not his real name, and yes, it was named after who you think it was. Initially, Infection was what he went by, but he changed it to Infek bin Laden because he heard of some rather interesting individual out in the Middle East. He thought Osama was badass for making some bold statements about the American military, so considering Infek was already anti-military, he thought he'd merge the two names. But again, Infek isn't his real name. Charles Hiltzheimer is. Charles was born into a family of great wealth, considering his father was a millionaire, but Charles never actually took any of the money, whether it was offered or not, because it was made from war profiteering, which Charles couldn't accept. He was kind of an anarchist and a pacifist. Yes, he did many drugs, but apparently he never had any alcohol in his life. He had views, morals, and a philosophy he wouldn't bend for anything, which is admirable. During presumably a Satanist group hangout, Charles met who he would later wed, Andrea. Andrea is the person who is still keeping the site up after all this time. She also once described the site as all the good disguised as bad, which is why the site is actually so awesome. It may have all this disturbing imagery and talk about things like rape and murder, but it's in reality a life story of a very interesting man and how he viewed the world as it was coming to a close, showing how much he loved and appreciated those close to him and how they affected him in his life. Not only does it have that, but it also has community interaction and some pretty gross imagery reminiscent of early internet low quality CGI. This website was a canvas gifted to Charles, Infec, and he made an honestly amazing and questionable art piece. Infec's final months were rather difficult. Being in the hospital non-stop, awaiting an eventual demise is already depressing, but then he would hear about the September 11th attacks. Terrorist attacks would startle and shock someone deeply, but then hearing that the person his alias was based off of was one of the people deeply involved in the attacks left Infec distraught. Not too long after 9/11, Infec would pass away. Andrea had been keeping the site up ever since. I mentioned and talked briefly about all the subpages and then their subpages, but I never talked about what happens just when you open the site now. When deathandhell.com was first made, it opened up to this page, but sometime in November or December of 2006, years after Infec's death, a new passage became the opening page. The passage goes as follows.
In the 18 months before my death, I proceeded to set forth the keys to death and hell. In this process, I envisioned a snapshot of the world as it appeared to me at that time, literally a cut and paste sculpture taken from various articles, science fiction, cultural and political events, happenings in the realms of the culture, flame wars on the Z list, my life, my world, my email, etc. So it was just a cut up of these things. Somehow, from this cut up, leaked out the most beautiful vision of infinite compassion, and this vision came forth and stood forth. Even amongst all the horror, it shone through so bright, really true, and undeniably real. There was more compassion and love for me than I had ever dreamed or imagined. It was like a garden paradise all around me, blooming with beauty and love. It was there all the time, this unbelievable garden, and it opened up to me. My life has been like heaven in so many ways. I am grateful I had an opportunity to see this possibility, and I want to share it with my fellow sentient beings. Even though death and hell may look like it's all dark, all black, and all horror, right there, glimmering on the other side, is infinite compassion. Right there, the clear light is shimmering through the void. It's not that hard to see if you just open up your eyes and look around. My life with Andrea, Agony, and the love that we were reflecting back and forth between each other is so magnificent and powerful that it was like we were facing death every day, celebrating our love every day. We were facing it because that was the way we lived. But for me, maybe it took the immense of physical death to bring it into full clarity. As my own death approaches steadily, I am blessed and deeply moved by the enormous display of affection and love from my daughter, Heidi. Heidi's love is a limitless ocean that has healed me so much from the pain of life. Though she is young, 17, and losing her dad, she shows all the signs of blooming into a spectacular woman of insight and compassion. I am surprised and grateful for the outpouring of tenderness, seeing those around me, and especially my only child, offering me such unconditional love and compassion changes me, heals me, and reaffirms the silent knowledge of my heart. When my sister Lori died, she gave me a greater understanding of death, and the communiques or the transmissions that I have received from her, and my grandmother too, reveal much about the after-death state. Though my heart touches many who are in this life still, it reaches also across the boundaries to touch those who have gone before me. Their bravery fuels my own. It is in their path of stars and ghostly footsteps that I will walk in. These are the gifts I take with me. I will go, caressed by the kisses of Newt. I face death without fear. I leave, for this world, the keys of death and hell, to unlock the secrets we keep from ourselves. But for any who could wonder, or wander lost in Temple Dahmer, I want to declare that the real secret of death and hell is infinite compassion. Those who know will know. The archetypal theriomorph is in the lotus. Infect bin Laden.
November 11th, 2001.
That passage makes it clear, explained better than anyone else could have. Infek actually did want to encapsulate how much he cherished those close to him, but in a more creative and visually disturbing fashion. With that, you can understand and appreciate Death and Hell.com, a dying man's opus.